October 11th, 1944. A cold wind rolled through the Welsh borderlands, dragging a low blanket of fog across the fields and the ruined silhouette of Castell Bryn Adrin, a medieval hill fort that had not seen real danger in hundreds of years until today. At the foot of those broken stone walls, a platoon of British Home Guard volunteers marched stiffly toward the ridge, rifles slung over shoulders, boots crunching frost-coated grass. They were old men, clerks, farmers, cobblers, war veterans of another lifetime, men who had expected their service to be symbolic, a formality the government maintained to soothe nerves on the home front. But that illusion began to buckle earlier that morning when a terrified shepherd ran into the village shouting that shots had whistled past his flock from somewhere near the old castle ruins. Captain Douglas Fairburn, a 48-year-old schoolmaster from Shropshire, with grey at his temples and a permanent frown etched into his features, now moved at the head of the line. He didn't like rumours. He liked facts. And the facts were simple and terrible. A German pilot had reportedly bailed out 2 nights earlier after a bomber was damaged over Liverpool. Search teams found nothing. People assumed the man had died in the hills, but Fairburn knew the terrain too well for that. If the shepherd had truly been fired upon, then the downed airman was alive and armed. And that meant trouble. Behind Fairburn trudged Arthur Llewellyn, 62 years old, a retired stonemason whose knees cracked every time he crouched, but whose hands still held a rifle, with the calm ease of someone who had built churches, bridges, and battlefields out of rock. He had grown up exploring the ruins of Castell Bryn Adrin as a boy, squeezing through its forgotten arrow loops, narrow slits carved into the walls long ago to allow an archer to fire from inside without exposing himself. He had once fit through them easily. Now, with age thickening his chest and shoulders, he barely fit an arm through. Still, the old knowledge lived inside him like marrow. The platoon reached the lower slope. The fog twisted around the broken battlements, hiding everything above except the tallest jagged stones. Fairburn raised his fist, and the line halted. Silence pressed in. The wind eased. Only the faint drip of moisture along the rocks broke the quiet. Then came the crack. A single rifle shot, sharp and close, cut the air. A puff of dirt erupted inches from Private Collins's boot. Collins froze, eyes wide. Another shot chased it, striking a stone where Fairburn's head had been a moment before he ducked. They had found their German. "Down! Down the lot of you!" Fairburn barked, and the home guard dropped among the rocks and tufts of gorse, breath fogging in the cold air. The sniper was clever. High ground, concealment, clear lines of sight down the hillside. The ruined castle made a perfect nest, its tangle of shadows and collapsed walls offering angles even an experienced British marksman would struggle to read. Fairburn knew a frontal approach would be suicide. Worse, the German was patient. 2 shots, 2 warnings. He was sighting them, testing their reactions. The next rounds would not miss. Arthur Llewellyn lay on his stomach, cheek pressed to the freezing soil. His old heart pounded, but not from fear. From memory. He knew those walls. He knew that castle in ways the German couldn't dream of, and in the blur of adrenaline, he caught sight of something the others didn't, a narrow shape in the fog halfway up the wall, a dark vertical slit, an arrow loop, a perfect medieval firing slit that looked directly toward their position. And then, the terrible realization hit him like a blow. The German wasn't firing from behind the arrow loop. He was firing toward it, cutting off the Home Guard's only covered approach. If they tried to climb the outer wall using the old steps, they would be killed before they reached the battlements. Fairburn crawled to him, breath tight. "Arthur, can you make sense of this? He's dug in deep up there." Arthur didn't answer right away. He was watching the fog roll past the old stones, watching how the faint light filtered through the loop. In his youth, he'd used that very slit for mischief, peeking through to watch travellers on the road below, carving his initials into the interior frame. The loop wasn't like most castle slits. This one had a slightly widened inner chamber, almost like a small stone pocket, carved by a long-dead mason, to give a defending archer room to shift angles. A thought flickered. Dangerous, ridiculous, but it grew roots fast. He whispered, "Captain, that loop. There's a blind angle behind it. If a man could crawl to the wall without being seen, he could slip his rifle through that slit and fire inward. The German won't expect a shot from inside the wall." Fairburn stared at him. "Arthur, that loop faces down the hill. It's under his direct fire." "Aye. But only if he sees you coming," Arthur said, eyes narrowing. "There's another way up. The sheep slope." Fairburn blinked. "The what?" Arthur nodded toward the east flank of the hill. Steep, covered in thick bracken and loose shale, impossible for boots to climb quietly. Except in wintertime when cold tightened the mud and the gorse thickened enough to mask crawling movement. Arthur had climbed it dozens of times as a reckless 13-year-old. His mother never knew. He turned to Fairburn with a kind of stubborn fire in his eyes that made the captain's stomach drop. "Give me one man," Arthur said. "Just one. We curve around the east slope, crawl to the loop's base, and I'll put a shot through before he ever knows we're there." "Arthur, you can't. You've got younger men, better shots than me, I know." "But I'm the only one who knows that wall." He swallowed. His throat felt tight. "Let me do this." Another shot cracked from above, this one slashing the air above Fairburn's cap. The German was repositioning, adjusting his aim with unsettling precision. Fairburn clenched his jaw. Every decision he made since joining the Home Guard had been measured, careful, mostly administrative, but here, for the first time, he felt the weight of a wartime choice, the sort that could get men killed or save a village. He whispered, "Take Harris with you. He's light on his feet, but Arthur, if anything feels wrong, you pull back. I mean it." Arthur nodded once. Minutes later, while the rest of the platoon kept low and tried to draw the sniper's fire, Arthur and young Private Harris slipped eastward into the fog. Moving on hands and knees, through bracken soaked with dew, each rustle sounded like thunder in Arthur's ears. His heart hammered. The slope steepened, and twice he felt shale shift beneath him, threatening to send both men sliding down in a noisy cascade. But they pressed on. The castle wall loomed closer, its stones dark and slick. Arthur saw the faint outline of the arrow loop, narrow, tall, and pale in the mist. Inches above it, a bullet suddenly struck stone, splintering rock. The German was firing again, unaware that his enemy was crawling beneath him like ghosts. Arthur's breath grew shallow. His palms were numb with cold and fear. Harris whispered, "Sir, can we really do this?" Arthur didn't respond. He was staring up at the loop, calculating angles, remembering childhood games, tracing the faint groove where his 13-year-old fingers had once carved his initials into the inner chamber. Somewhere inside that wall was a memory waiting to serve him. He steadied his hands, lifted his rifle, and began to rise slowly toward the stone slit that had slept for 600 years, preparing to awaken it for war one last time. Arthur's back pressed against the cold, moss-bitten stones of the castle wall. The arrow loop towered just above eye level, narrow as a knife's edge on the outside but widening on the inner side, just as he remembered. In the fog, the opening looked like a pale wound in the medieval masonry, waiting, breathing, as if aware of the two men crouched beneath it, with rifles and fear threading through their veins. Harris trembled beside him. The boy was barely 20, cheeks still carrying the softness of someone who had known more fields than battlefields. His breath came shallow, condensing into thin mist as he whispered, "He's close, sir. Must be right above that ledge." Arthur nodded, lifting one gloved hand to signal silence. "Feel the wall," he told himself. "Trust the stone." Every mark on these battlements had been his playground once. Even now, he could sense the geometry of the castle as if muscle memory guided him. The thin walkway behind the loop, the break in the wall 3 feet to the right, the half-collapsed parapet where the German sniper had probably set up his hide. Another shot fired overhead, sharp, disciplined, unfazed. The German was firing at the Home Guard's pinned platoon far down the slope, unaware that danger now crouched beneath his very perch. Arthur raised himself another inch, placing his fingertips along the stone ledge below the loop. He could feel the slight inward swell of the masonry, the widened inner pocket designed centuries earlier, so Welsh defenders could shift a bow left or right without exposing themselves. No modern sniper, certainly no German pilot unfamiliar with medieval architecture, would anticipate a rifle barrel emerging from this angle. He turned his head slightly toward Harris and whispered, barely audible, "We only get one chance." Harris swallowed hard and nodded. Arthur lifted his Lee Enfield, steadying the wood stock against the stone. The barrel fit snugly into the slit, so snugly he feared any touch might scrape and give them away. Slowly, painfully slowly, he eased the muzzle through, letting it settle into the darkness of the inner chamber. The air inside smelled ancient, dust, decayed mortar, old lime and colder centuries. He pressed his cheek against the butt of the rifle. Through the loop, his field of vision narrowed to a thin cone, but that was enough. He could see the inner wall's shadowed walkway, a patch of broken stone lit by the muted grey of the fog, and then movement. A figure shifted behind a collapsed section of parapet. A helmet shape, a shoulder, the outline of a scoped Mauser rifle as the German adjusted position, peering out over the edge to fire again on the men below. Arthur exhaled slowly. He had fired rifles most of his life, on farms, at competitions, during the last war when he was young and strong and believed his usefulness had an expiration date. Now, in this strange twilight of his life, that usefulness returned sharper than ever. "You've got one shot, old man," he told himself. He steadied, finger tightening gently against the trigger. A crack echoed inside the stone chamber, deep, resonant, final. Arthur felt the recoil kick into his shoulder, felt dust shake loose from the interior of the wall. Through the slit, he saw the German jerk backward, rifle skidding across the stones as the man collapsed into the shadow behind him. No cry, no second movement, just the sudden, heavy stillness of a threat extinguished. Harris gasped, hand flying to his mouth. Arthur didn't move for several seconds, stunned by the intimate echo of the shot within the ancient stone pocket. It felt as if the castle itself had fired the round, as if centuries of Welsh defenders had lent him their aim. Finally, he lowered the rifle and stepped back from the loop, exhaling the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Good Lord," Harris whispered. You got him." Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he listened. The hillside had gone eerily quiet. No more shots from above, only the wind sighing through the ruins. He tapped Harris's shoulder and whispered, "We're not done. We need to be sure." They moved along the base of the wall until they reached a crumbled corner where roots and loose stones allowed them to climb. Arthur gritted his teeth as his knees protested, but he forced his body upward, gripping the jagged stonework like a man half his age. Harris followed closely, breathing hard. At the top, fog wrapped the battlements in a pale shroud. Broken stones jutted like rotten teeth. A single twisted oak branch reached in from the outer edge, and in front of the parapet, sprawled on the damp stone walkway, lay the German sniper. He was young, shockingly young, perhaps 23. His flight suit was torn, rain-soaked, stained from the crash. A carbine scope gleamed beside him. A small satchel lay open with a compass, a ration bar, and a photograph of a girl no older than 16 tucked against a folded letter. Harris stepped forward, eyes wide. "Sir, he looks no older than me." Arthur didn't respond. He knelt beside the man, pressing fingers gently to the carotid. Nothing. The silence of the dead. Fairburn and the rest of the home guard were climbing toward them now, cautiously, but with renewed energy, sensing the danger had passed. Their footsteps grew louder as they approached through the fog. Arthur stood, the stone beneath his boots slick with morning frost. He didn't feel triumph, didn't feel relief, only the cold ache of necessity, the grim weight of having ended a life because there had been no other road through the morning. Fairburn emerged through the fog, rifle ready until he saw the still form on the stones. His shoulders lowered. He approached Arthur and placed a hand on his arm. "You did it," the captain said quietly. "Saved us all." Arthur didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the arrow loop, its thin vertical shape etched in grey light. He imagined the castle's medieval defenders watching through it centuries ago, facing their own invaders with bowstrings drawn. Something about that parallel chilled him more than the weather. Fairburn followed his eyes. "You used that? Through the loop?" Arthur nodded slightly. Fairburn exhaled, half impressed, half incredulous. "Only you would think of that, Llewellyn." Arthur looked at the dead young German one last time and murmured, "Aye, but I wish I hadn't had to." The men gathered around, some whispering prayers, others whispering disbelief, but none daring to speak too loudly. The fog swallowed their breath, turning voices to ghosts. And then, far below, a faint shout drifted up the hillside. It wasn't British. Arthur froze. Harris stiffened. Fairburn's head snapped toward the sound. "Did you hear?" Another shout. German again. Then another. And another. Arthur's stomach turned to ice as he stepped to the parapet and peered down through the swirling mist. More figures were moving in the fog below the ridge. Not one. 4. Armed. Moving in formation. Coming straight toward the ruins. Arthur's pulse hammered. "Captain, we've got trouble." Fairburn's eyes narrowed. "This wasn't just a lone pilot." "No," Arthur whispered. "It was a forward sniper." He swallowed hard. "And the rest of his team is coming." For a moment, the fog itself seemed to tighten around them, as if the air understood the danger before any of the men did. Captain Fairburn stepped forward, leaning out over the broken parapet, straining to see through the shifting grey. Below, indistinct shadows moved with deliberate caution, dark shapes slipping between rocks and gorse. 4 men at least, possibly 5, armed, trained, advancing as a unit, not wandering like lost airmen. The downed pilot had never been alone. He had been bait. Arthur's fingers curled around the cold stone until grit bit into his skin. The realization that the sniper had been a forward picket, positioned to halt local patrols, meant something worse. These Germans were not fleeing. They were seeking something: supplies, intelligence, a route east, or the safety of terrain deeper in the countryside. And they were willing to fight to reach it. Fairburn turned sharply. "Positions! Quiet and fast! We hold this place!" The Home Guard scattered along the battlements, moving into shallow cover behind broken walls and collapsed beams. They were clerks, tradesmen, pensioners, men who had never expected to hold a medieval ruin against armed soldiers of the Reich. Yet none hesitated. Arthur felt Harris trembling beside him. "Are they coming for us, sir?" "Not for us," Arthur whispered, "but we're in their way." A crack of a rifle answered him. A bullet clanged off a chunk of stone inches above Harris's head, spraying chips across the walkway. Men ducked. Someone cursed under his breath. Another round struck the outer face of the wall, not the probing shots of a sniper, but the rapid, aggressive testing of soldiers advancing under cover. The Germans were close now. Fairburn hissed, "Hold your fire until my order." Arthur positioned himself behind the same arrow loop he'd used earlier. The medieval slit felt like an old friend now, its cold stones shielding him as he leaned in to peer through the narrow field of vision it afforded. He could see flickers of movement between the bracken, dark cloth, the glint of metal, the blur of a helmet crest. The Germans were spreading out, trying to flank the ruin, trying to find blind spots. Arthur's heart pounded. The castle had blind spots, many of them. Places where centuries of erosion had carved gaps into the walls, where attackers could crawl up without being seen. But he also remembered a trick from his youth, the old fallen lintel stone behind the keep wall, narrow space beneath it, a natural choke point. If anyone tried to slip through, he grabbed Fairburn's arm. They'll try the fallen lintel on the north wall. It's the easiest climb. Fairburn nodded sharply. Take Harris. Cut them off. Arthur hesitated. Sir, that's the closest point. They'll reach it first. Fairburn's voice hardened. Then move faster. Arthur didn't argue. He pulled Harris along the inner walkway, boots sliding on frost, breath clouding the air. They slipped into the shadowed inner corner of the ruin, where centuries-old stones had collapsed into jagged heaps. The lintel lay ahead, a massive slab of weathered granite that had once crowned a doorway. Now leaning at a shallow angle like a fallen giant. Behind it yawned a narrow crawl space, dark, tight, overgrown with tangled ferns and roots. Harris stared. We're waiting there. No, Arthur whispered. We're firing from there. He knelt, pushing aside bracken, and eased himself into the crawl space. The air was damp, earthy, thick with the smell of rotted vegetation. Roots brushed his hair, his shoulders scraped stone, but the gap faced outward, toward the slope the Germans were climbing, a perfect hidden murder hole. Harris squeezed in beside him, awkward and panicked. I can't see a thing. You don't need to, Arthur murmured. Just listen. Outside, the hillside rustled. Low German voices murmured in clipped syllables. Boots crushed dead bracken. Metal scraped stone as rifles shifted. They were right there. Arthur lifted his rifle, angling the barrel through a notch in the roots. The space was so tight he could barely breathe, but he steadied himself by leaning against the stone behind him. Every instinct told him to fire now before they were spotted, before a shadow appeared directly ahead. A German soldier crouched low, gripping the edge of the fallen lintel as he prepared to slip under it. Arthur pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked. The shadow collapsed. Another soldier behind him shouted, scrambling back. Harris inhaled sharply, raising his own rifle, but his shaking hands knocked the barrel against the stone, sending a loud clack echoing through the crawl space. Arthur grabbed his shoulder. Easy, lad, easy! Outside, German voices barked orders. Another shot rang out, this one from Fairburn's men on the rampart. A second. A third. The hillside exploded into a chaotic storm of gunfire, shouts, and ricochets slicing stone. Arthur dragged himself partially out from beneath the lintel, peering through the bracken. One German lay still, another crawled behind a boulder, firing upward toward the battlements. A third sprinted through a gap in the scrub. Harris fired blindly, missing by inches, but forcing the soldier to dive for cover. Fairburn's voice boomed from above. Hold the line! Don't let them reach the wall! Arthur raised his rifle again, sighting the man behind the boulder. The fog had begun to thin, letting weak sunlight bleed through in pale streaks. The German lifted his head, just a sliver, and Arthur squeezed the trigger. The man jerked backward, slumping out of view. A machine pistol burst answered. Stitching the ground dangerously close to Arthur's legs, he rolled to cover, breath ragged. Harris flinched. Sir, there's more of them! Arthur followed his gaze, two figures now angling toward the east side of the ruin, trying to reach a collapsed section of outer wall where the stones dipped low. If they made it inside, the home guard would be surrounded. Arthur forced himself to stand, bones protesting, and climbed out from beneath the lintel. Come on, we take them before they reach the breach. He and Harris scrambled up the incline, weaving between stones and dead brush. For a moment, Arthur felt young again, scrambling across these same battlements as a boy, heart pounding for adventure, not survival. The memory sharpened his focus. They reached the collapsed wall. Arthur crouched behind a large stone block, Harris beside him. The two Germans approached, silent, fast, well-trained, their uniforms mud-stained but intact, their movements coordinated. Arthur whispered, On my mark. The Germans closed to 15 yards. Now! Arthur fired first, the shot hitting the lead soldier squarely. Harris fired an instant later, his bullet grazing the second man's shoulder, spinning him sideways. The German dropped to one knee, raising his weapon to return fire. Arthur didn't think. He swung his rifle like a club, stepping into the open and smashing the butt squarely against the man's helmet. The impact rang through his arms. The German collapsed in a heap. Harris stared, stunned. "Sir, you—" "No time for praise," Arthur panted. "More may be coming." But they weren't. Silence seeped slowly back into the hillside. Gunfire faded. The echo of conflict died among the ancient stones. Somewhere above, Fairburn shouted for a ceasefire. The men called back, voices shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. It was over. Arthur stood there, breath steaming, hands trembling not from fear, but from the sudden release of it. The hillside lay littered with broken bracken, spent casings, and still shapes in grey fog. Harris exhaled shakily. We held them off. We actually did." Arthur nodded. His heart ached, not with pride, but with the complicated weight that settled after violence. He had defended his home, his land, his men. But he could not ignore that each German soldier had been young, desperate, far from home. Fairburn approached, boots crunching frost. "Arthur," he said quietly, "you saved us again. That old loop, that crawl space, no one else could have known those tricks." Arthur managed a tired smile. "Just the castle reminding me I grew up wrong." Fairburn shook his head. "No, the castle reminding us that courage doesn't age." The wind swept across the battlements, carrying with it the faint smell of cold earth and spent gunpowder. The fog thinned further, revealing more of the morning light, soft, weak, but enough to paint the old stones gold. Arthur placed a hand on the weathered wall, fingers tracing the grooves cut by men who had died centuries before he was born. He whispered, almost to himself, it wasn't bravery, it was remembering. Fairburn looked at him, puzzled. Remembering what? Arthur's eyes drifted to the arrow loop, the same slit he had climbed through as a boy. The same slit that had given him victory twice in one impossible morning. "That even old stones," he murmured, "still know how to protect the people who listen." And as the home guard regrouped, gathering around the ruins with stunned relief, Arthur Llewellyn stood beneath the ancient wall, its guardian once more, in a war 600 years too late and exactly right on time.